10 fingers. That's what every pianist learns to depend on, what every classical piece is written for, what 3 centuries of piano music assumes you'll have available. When 35-year-old James Mitchell lost the use of his right hand in a car accident 3 years ago, most people, including his own doctors, assumed his career as a concert pianist was over. How do you play Chopin with 5 fingers? How do you perform Rachmaninoff when half your instrument is suddenly unreachable? James Mitchell had a different question. Not how to play with one hand, but how to play better with one hand than most people play with two. When James wheeled onto the America's Got Talent stage, Simon Cowell thought he was about to witness another inspirational story of someone adapting to disability. He had no idea he was about to hear some of the most technically brilliant and emotionally profound piano music he'd ever experienced, all created by a man who had transformed his greatest loss into his most extraordinary innovation. Let me take you back to the moment before James Mitchell proved that mastery isn't about what you have, it's about what you do with whatever remains. It was Tuesday evening at the Dolby Theater in Los Angeles, and America's Got Talent was in the middle of what would become its most musically revolutionary season yet. The familiar energy buzzed through the venue, 3,400 audience members filling the red velvet seats, many of them from classical music communities, disability advocacy groups, and medical rehabilitation programs who had heard about James's unprecedented approach to single-handed piano mastery. Simon Cowell sat at the judges' table in his signature black t-shirt and perfectly tailored blazer, but tonight his expression carried more anticipation than usual. The producers had briefed him about this particular contestant in terms that seemed almost impossible. They'd explained that he might be witnessing someone redefine what was possible in classical piano performance using techniques that had never been developed before. Sofia Vergara was unusually focused, having been deeply moved during the pre-show briefing about James's journey from devastating injury to musical innovation. Heidi Klum and Howie Mandel were both curious and respectful, understanding that they were about to witness something that challenged fundamental assumptions about musical performance and physical capability. Terry Crews had spent extra time preparing for this introduction, knowing that his words needed to honor both James's loss and his remarkable adaptation. The evening had already been memorable, but everyone involved in the production understood that what was about to happen would be unprecedented. This wasn't just about talent or inspiration. This was about witnessing the evolution of an art form, the creation of new possibilities from impossible circumstances. Backstage, James Mitchell sat in his wheelchair in the contestant waiting area, his right arm resting motionlessly in his lap while his left hand moved through silent practice patterns on his knee. At 35, he still carried the bearing of the professional musician he had always been, but there was something deeper in his expression now, a hard-won wisdom that came from having to rebuild everything he thought he knew about his art. Beside him stood Sarah Mitchell, his wife of 8 years, a woman who had watched her husband transform devastating loss into unprecedented innovation. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, gently adjusting the black dress shirt that accommodated James's paralyzed right arm. James looked at her with eyes that held both sadness for what he had lost and excitement for what he had discovered. "Nervous," he admitted, "but also eager. I've spent 3 years developing these techniques, and tonight I finally get to show people that the music didn't die in that accident. It just learned to speak with a different voice." The journey to this moment had been both heartbreaking and miraculous. James had been at the peak of his career, guest soloist with major symphonies, recording contracts with classical labels, reviews that praised his transcendent technical skill and profound musical intelligence. Then came the night that divided his life into before and after. A drunk driver running a red light, a collision that left James with complete paralysis of his right side, and doctors telling him that his concert career was finished. "We can help you adapt to daily life," the neurologist had said. "We can work on rehabilitation for basic tasks, But playing piano professionally, I'm sorry, but that requires capabilities that you no longer have. But James had refused to accept that assessment. During his months of medical rehabilitation, he had begun experimenting with left-hand only pieces, studying the limited repertoire that existed for single-handed piano performance. Then he had gone further, beginning to arrange two-handed classical masterworks for single-handed performance, developing techniques that had never been attempted before. The piano isn't just about having 10 fingers, he had told Sarah during those early months of adaptation. It's about understanding harmony, melody, rhythm, expression. All of that is still here, he had said, tapping his temple. I just need to find new ways to get it from my brain to the keys. James Mitchell, called Maria, one of the production assistants, her voice carrying special respect since everyone on staff had been amazed by James's rehearsal earlier that day. James wheeled himself toward the stage entrance, his left hand unconsciously running through fingering patterns that had become second nature over 3 years of intensive retraining. Remember, Sarah said, walking alongside his wheelchair, you're not just performing tonight, you're showing the world what's possible. You're proving that music finds a way. I know, James replied. This isn't just my performance. This is for every musician who's ever been told their career was over because of an accident, an illness, a limitation. This is for everyone who's ever had to choose between giving up and finding a new way forward. Terry Crew's voice carried across the theater. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome James Mitchell. The lights came up and James began wheeling himself toward the grand piano that had been positioned center stage. The same type of concert grand he had performed on in symphony halls around the world. The audience's reaction was immediate and respectful. Many people recognized the wheelchair and the obvious paralysis of James's right side, responding with the kind of encouraging applause often given to individuals overcoming physical challenges. But others, particularly those from musical backgrounds, leaned forward with genuine curiosity about what they were about to hear. Simon leaned forward, studying James with deep interest. There was something about this man that commanded attention not through his disability, but through the quiet confidence of someone who had mastered something extraordinary. Good evening, James, Terry said warmly as James positioned his wheelchair beside the piano bench. Good evening, James replied, his voice carrying the clarity and confidence of someone comfortable with public performance. Thank you for having me here tonight. Tell us a little about yourself and your background. James transferred himself from his wheelchair to the piano bench with practiced ease, positioning himself so that his left hand could access the full range of the keyboard. I'm James Mitchell. I'm 35 years old, and I've been a professional pianist for 15 years. 3 years ago, I was in a car accident that left my right side paralyzed. My doctors told me my concert career was finished, but I disagreed. Tonight, I'm here to show that music doesn't require 10 fingers. It requires passion, dedication, and the willingness to find new ways to express what lives in your heart. Simon found himself completely absorbed by James's explanation, beginning to understand that he was about to witness something unprecedented in classical music. Can you tell us about how you've adapted your playing technique? Terry continued. For 3 years, I've been developing what I call compressed harmony, taking pieces written for 2 hands and reimagining them for 1 hand without losing the musical complexity or emotional depth. I've studied the limited repertoire of left-hand-only classical music and expanded it, creating arrangements of pieces that were never meant to be played by 1 hand. James positioned his left hand over the keys with the careful precision of someone who had spent years perfecting every movement. The challenge isn't just technical, he continued. It's about proving that adaptation doesn't mean limitation. When you can only use 5 fingers instead of 10, those 5 fingers have to work twice as hard, move twice as fast, and express twice as much. In some ways, losing my right hand has made me a better pianist than I ever was before. That's incredible, James. What are you going to perform for us tonight? James looked directly at the camera, understanding that his performance would reach far beyond the theater. I'm going to play 3 pieces. First, Chopin's Revolutionary Etude, arranged for left hand only, then Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C.S. minor, which I've compressed from two hands to one, and finally my own composition called Phoenix, a piece I wrote about rising from the ashes of what you thought was impossible. All right, James, Terry said, stepping back with genuine anticipation. The stage is yours. James took a deep breath, positioned his left hand over the keys, and began to play. What emerged from the piano challenged every assumption about what was possible with single-handed performance. The Chopin piece, normally requiring both hands working in complex coordination, flowed from James's left hand with stunning clarity and emotional depth. His fingers moved across the keyboard with incredible speed and precision, somehow managing to capture both the melody and harmony that the piece required, using techniques that seemed to defy the physical limitations of having only one working hand. Simon's mouth fell open. This wasn't adapted music or simplified arrangements. This was full, complex classical performance executed with a level of technical skill that was extraordinary by any standard. As James moved into the Rachmaninoff Prelude, the complexity increased dramatically. His left hand was performing passages that normally required two hands working together, somehow managing to convey the piece's famous cascading harmonies and dramatic emotional arc through the work of just 5 fingers. Sophia was leaning forward, completely absorbed by the technical mastery she was witnessing. This wasn't just impressive adaptation. This was virtuoso-level performance that happened to be executed with one hand. Heidi was visibly moved, recognizing that she was hearing something that challenged everything she thought she knew about musical limitation and possibility. Howie was unusually serious, understanding that he was witnessing someone redefine what was achievable in classical music, but it was the audience's reaction that was most telling. The initial sympathetic applause had given way to complete silence, the kind of focused attention reserved for truly exceptional musical performance. They weren't watching someone overcome disability anymore. They were listening to a master musician performing at the highest level. As James reached his own composition, Phoenix, the emotional impact became even more profound. The piece seemed to tell the story of his journey, the crash, the loss, the despair, and finally the discovery that adaptation could lead not to limitation, but to new forms of excellence. The music that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, technically complex, and emotionally devastating. It was clear that James hadn't just learned to play with one hand, he had discovered musical possibilities that wouldn't have existed if he hadn't been forced to find new ways to express his artistry. When James played the final notes and his left hand came to rest on the keys, the silence in the theater was profound. 3,400 people had just experienced something that challenged their understanding of musical performance, physical limitation, and human adaptability. Then the applause began, and it was unlike anything in AGT history. This wasn't sympathetic encouragement or inspirational appreciation. This was the kind of ovation reserved for extraordinary artistic achievement. James sat at the piano, breathing deeply, his left hand still resting on the keys that had just produced musical magic. Simon stood up slowly, his expression showing genuine amazement and deep respect. "James," he said, and had to pause to collect his thoughts, "I need you to understand what just happened here." James looked at him with the quiet attention of someone who had just shared their most important work with the world. What you just performed wasn't good for someone with a disability. What you just performed was extraordinary by any standard. That was a virtuoso-level classical piano performance that happened to be executed with one hand instead of two. Simon's voice was carrying more emotion than usual. You haven't just adapted to your condition, you've innovated beyond it. You've created new techniques, new possibilities, new ways of approaching classical music that didn't exist before your accident. The audience was hanging on every word, understanding that Simon was recognizing something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of artistic breakthrough. But more than that, Simon continued, You've proven that mastery isn't about what you have, it's about what you do with whatever you have. You've shown that limitation can become innovation, that loss can become discovery. James was visibly moved, understanding that Simon was recognizing not just his performance, but his entire journey of adaptation and growth. "Thank you," James said simply. "Music saved my life after the accident, not just emotionally, but creatively. Losing my right hand forced me to discover musical possibilities I never would have explored otherwise. In some ways, the accident gave me back my music in a deeper way than I'd ever experienced before." Simon walked closer to the stage, his expression showing profound respect. "James Mitchell, what you've accomplished represents one of the most important developments in classical piano performance I've ever witnessed. You haven't just overcome your disability, you've transformed it into artistic innovation that could influence how music is taught, performed, and understood." He paused, looking out at the audience and cameras. "But beyond the technical achievement, you've demonstrated something crucial about human adaptability, about the relationship between limitation and creativity, about what becomes possible when we refuse to accept that our circumstances define our potential." Simon walked to his golden buzzer with absolute conviction. "James Mitchell, you receive my golden buzzer for redefining what's possible in classical music, for proving that innovation often comes from necessity, and for showing that the most beautiful music sometimes emerges from the deepest challenges." Simon pressed the golden buzzer with the solemnity of someone recognizing genuine artistic breakthrough. Golden confetti fell from the ceiling, but it seemed almost secondary to the musical magic that had just filled the theater. James looked up at the falling gold and smiled, not with surprise, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just proved everything he had spent 3 years working toward. Sarah appeared from the wings, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her husband. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You didn't just perform tonight. You proved that music really does find a way." "The music was always there," James replied. "I just had to learn a new language to speak it." 3 months later, James Mitchell won America's Got Talent, but more importantly, his performance revolutionized the field of adaptive classical music. Conservatories began developing single-handed performance techniques as part of their standard curriculum. The James Mitchell Foundation was established to provide resources for musicians dealing with acquired disabilities. His arrangements and techniques became standard study materials for adaptive music therapy programs. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the change in how the classical music world viewed physical limitation. James had proved that disability didn't mean the end of professional performance. It meant the beginning of new forms of musical expression that could enrich the entire art form. The lesson James Mitchell taught the world that night is profound. Mastery isn't about having perfect tools. It's about using whatever tools you have with perfect dedication. Innovation often emerges from necessity, and sometimes losing something forces you to discover capabilities you never knew existed. Simon Cowell learned that true talent adapts, evolves, and finds new ways to express itself regardless of circumstances. That the most important performances aren't just technically excellent, they're transformative, changing how we think about what's possible. And James proved that the human spirit, when faced with limitation, doesn't just endure, it innovates, creating new possibilities that make the world more beautiful, more inclusive, and more aware of what becomes achievable when we refuse to accept that circumstances define potential.